The cold evening shrouded the city in a gray blanket, chilling to the bone. A light breeze picked up trash from the empty sidewalks, scattering it as if foreshadowing a coming storm. Jamal, a 14-year-old, moved slowly, leaning on his old battered crutches. He was returning home from visiting a friend, clutching his textbooks wrapped in a shabby backpack. He only had a few blocks to walk home, but with each step the feeling of unease grew stronger. There was the faint sound of an approaching car behind him. The faint light of the headlights slid across the wet pavement and momentarily illuminated his lean figure. Jamal felt his heartbeat quicken, but he forced himself not to turn around. He knew. In his neighborhood, the police were often looking for someone to stop, and often those stops ended in more than just a conversation. Meanwhile, behind the wheel of the patrol car sat Officer Thomas Grace, a man about whom even his colleagues whispered. He was known for his brutal methods, his excessive violence, and, worst of all, his hatred for those who looked different from him. Thomas gripped the steering wheel so hard that his fingers turned white when he saw Jamal in the headlights. A black kid on crutches? I wonder what he's doing here. He muttered to himself contemptuously as he stopped the car at the edge of the road. To him, this was just another potential intruder, and the fact that the teenager was black seemed reason enough to intervene. Jamal heard the sound of brakes and realized that the car had stopped. Now his fear was almost palpable. He glanced furtively into the reflection of the store window to see who was following him. A police car with flashing lights was behind him. "Take it easy. Just keep walking," he repeated to himself, though his hands were shaking so badly that his crutches were nearly slipping. "Hey, you! Stop!" Officer Thomas's gruff voice broke the silence. Jamal stopped, feeling the chill creep up inside him as well as outside. Thomas got out of the car, slamming the door so hard that the sound echoed down the deserted street. The air smelled of menace. His heavy footsteps drew closer, and each footfall sounded like a gunshot. "What are you doing here?" The officer stepped close to Jamal, forcing the boy to raise his head. "I'm just going home, sir," Jamal replied quietly, trying not to meet his eyes with the man who literally radiated aggression. "Home? On crutches? At night? Who are you kidding, huh?" Thomas's voice grew louder and sharper. He gave the teenager a look of contempt, as if he'd already passed judgment. Jamal tried to explain, but the words stuck in his throat. Thomas grinned, and it was more like the grin of a predator preparing to attack. Everything inside Jamal was screaming, "Run!" But where to? He knew that running from a cop was a death sentence. At that moment, Jamal didn't yet know that this evening would change not only his life, but also his mother's, who would soon turn fear into rage in a fight for justice. Jamal stood, gripping his crutches so tightly that his fingers turned white. His heart was pounding so loudly that even the policeman seemed to hear the sound. Thomas Grace walked slowly around the teenager like a predator sizing up its prey. Each step echoed in the empty street, emphasizing the hopelessness of the situation. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Thomas asked hoarsely, looking into Jamal's eyes as if he wanted to get a confession out of him. "Going home, sir," Jamal said again, trying to keep his voice steady, though his voice shook. He could feel the officer's heavy gaze drilling into him, as if the very fact of his existence demanded an explanation. "Home?" Thomas grinned, looking the teenager over from head to toe with obvious disbelief. "You look like you've already done something. Let me see your backpack." "They're just books, sir. I didn't do anything wrong," Jamal tried to explain, but Thomas had already reached out, roughly snatching the backpack from the boy. The books fell to the ground, one of them falling directly into a puddle of muddy water. "Books, you say?" Thomas threw the backpack contemptuously to the ground, not even trying to hide his aggression. "You think carrying around a couple of textbooks makes you clean? I know your type. Just the sight of a black kid at night is cause for scrutiny." Jamal could hardly hold back his tears. Every word the policeman said hit him like a whip. He tried to keep his composure, but deep down, he was filled with impotent rage. "Take off the hood," Thomas commanded, stepping closer and tugging sharply at the fabric. "I don't like it when these, what do you call them, hide their faces." Jamal was barely on his feet when Thomas tore open his hood. His crutches creaked, but he straightened again, trying to maintain some dignity. "You're not welcome here. It's better for people like you to stay home and not come out. You're too much trouble." Thomas continued with obvious pleasure, reveling in his power. Jamal could not believe that this was happening to him. All his life he had heard stories of injustice, of police aggression against people like him. But it was one thing to listen, and quite another to be in the center of this hell. "I've done nothing wrong, sir," he finally said quietly, lowering his eyes so as not to provoke the officer further. "Didn't, you say?" Thomas kicked the crutch sharply with his foot, knocking it off balance. Jamal tried to hold on, but he fell, hitting his knee on the sidewalk. Pain shot through him, but he didn't even have time to moan. Thomas was standing over him like a giant over defeated prey. "Listen, kid," Thomas said, leaning closer so that the smell of tobacco and cheap coffee was almost unbearable. "You think your skin color gives you the right to go wherever you want? No, buddy, that's not how the world works." Thomas pulled out his walkie-talkie and lazily reported that he had detained a suspicious subject without bothering to explain. Jamal realized that this man had already decided his fate without knowing his name or his story. "Stand up," Thomas ordered, but Jamal couldn't get up. His leg hurt, his crutches lay far away. "Are you kidding me?" I said. "Get up." When Jamal couldn't follow the order quickly enough, Thomas stepped closer, grabbed his arm, and roughly dragged him upward. Jamal cried out in pain, but his voice was drowned out by the noise of the radio. At that moment, something clicked in Jamal's mind. He knew that words wouldn't change anything. In this man's eyes, he wasn't a human being, just a black teenager to unleash all his hatred on. But Jamal did not yet know that this was only the beginning of the nightmare that would rock his world. Not only humiliation lay ahead, but events that would make even Thomas question his power. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from and whether you have faced something similar in your life. We value your opinions and experiences. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new stories. And now, we continue. Thomas Grace stood over Jamal, who was struggling to rise, leaning on one leg. His face was contorted with pain, but he remained stubbornly silent. The policeman clenched his teeth and slowly pulled out the handcuffs. He knew there was no reason to detain him, but it didn't matter to him. His task was clear: to show who was in charge and to assert his authority. "You're hiding something, aren't you?" Thomas said, leaning over the boy. His voice was full of sarcasm, with a sense of menace in it. "I know your kind. Sneaking around, looking for something to steal. You think because you have crutches, I'll believe you're innocent?" "I didn't do anything," Jamal said with difficulty, fighting back tears. He knew that tears would only make the policeman angry, and he tried to hold them back, despite the pain and humiliation. "Didn't do anything?" Thomas laughed so loudly that the sound echoed through the empty street. That's what I like best about people like you. Always innocent, aren't they? Well, we'll see. He stepped toward the backpack lying there, ripped open the clasp, and began rummaging through the boy's belongings. Books, pens, a notebook. Thomas tossed them aside on the ground as if they were trash. When he found nothing suspicious, his face darkened. So, you're hiding something else. What's in your pockets? He asked sharply, straightening up and taking a step toward Jamal. Nothing, sir, Jamal replied. He raised his hands to show that his pockets were empty, but Thomas only grinned. Never take a criminal's word for it, Thomas hissed, and without waiting for permission, began searching the teenager. His rough hands gripped the boy's clothes, searching for evidence. Jamal felt his lean body shake under the weight of humiliation. This wasn't just a search. This was a deliberate insult. A crowd began to gather. A few passers-by stopped at a safe distance, watching what was happening. Whispers and indignant looks began to spread among the people. One woman took out her cell phone to film what was happening. "Will you stop it? It's a baby," shouted someone from the crowd. The voice sounded confident, but fear of the officer slipped through. Thomas glanced around at the crowd and grinned. He even liked being watched. He felt like the hero of the stage, full of power. These people didn't matter to him, and neither did their opinions. "It's okay," he said loudly, addressing the crowd. "Detaining a suspect. You don't want criminals roaming your streets, do you?" Jamal looked at the crowd, his eyes screaming for help, but no one dared to intervene. The camera phone was the only thing that could bear witness to his humiliation. "Suspicious behavior. Enough to detain him," Thomas added, and without waiting, he grabbed Jamal's hands, roughly clasping them behind his back. The handcuffs snapped shut with a sharp metallic sound that made the boy wince. "You have no right," someone in the crowd shouted again. "You'd better mind your own business," Thomas shouted, glaring angrily away. His words sounded like a threat, and the crowd fell silent. Jamal, stiffening in pain, tried not to cry. He could feel the metal handcuffs cutting his skin and knew that any movement would cause more pain. Thomas jerked him up and dragged him like a rag doll toward the patrol car. "See how simple it is," Thomas whispered to Jamal before he put him in the car. "You don't mean anything. No one will even argue, so get over it." Outside the car window, Jamal could see the faces of the people gathered. Their eyes expressed pity and fear. Some had already started to leave, not wanting to be involved. The only one left was the woman with the phone, who kept filming. But Jamal wasn't sure it would help. The car pulled away, leaving behind an empty street full of silence. The words of the policeman echoed in the boy's mind. He knew that only the worst was ahead of him, but even he couldn't predict how far it would go. The patrol car came to an abrupt halt near an abandoned stretch of road. The dense gloom of night shrouded the street, hiding what was happening from view. Thomas pulled Jamal out of the car so roughly that the boy nearly lost his balance. His handcuffs remained tightened so tightly that his wrists burned with pain. "Come on, move!" Thomas shouted, pushing Jamal forward. The teenager swayed, barely able to stand on one leg. The crutches were still in the car. Thomas hadn't even thought to take them. "Sir, please," Jamal said quietly, trying to explain himself. His voice shook like a hunted animal. "I haven't done anything. Just let me go." "Shut up." Thomas turned sharply and stepped toward Jamal, his face twisted with contempt. "You think you can tell me what to do? People like you don't belong in my town. Jamal stood, trying not to fall, but his body wouldn't listen. Every muscle screamed with tension. Thomas stepped even closer, his heavy boots slipping on the gravel, and he grabbed the teenager by the collar. "Do you realize how tired I am of this view of you? Your complaints, your rights. You think you have rights?" He continued, bringing his face close to Jamal's so that the boy could smell tobacco and rage. A crowd began to gather nearby, attracted by the shouts and noise. They were hesitant to get too close, but their concerned looks did not escape Thomas. He turned to them, glancing around. "Nothing of interest here. Go home," he commanded, but instead several people pulled out their phones, preparing to film what was happening. "Let him go, it's a child," shouted a woman from the crowd. Her voice was shaking, but there was determination in it. Thomas only grinned. He even liked the fact that his actions were attracting attention. It increased his sense of power. He slowly pulled out the stun gun, raised it where the crowd could see it, and turned to Jamal. "You think being filmed is going to make a difference?" "No, kid," he said, turning to the boy and turning on the device. The ominous crackle of discharges broke the silence. "Sir, please," Jamal tried to say, but he couldn't finish. A bolt of electricity struck him in the chest, and the world around him slowed down. The boy's body twitched as if he'd been thrown into a stream of lightning. His crutches, which he had managed to grab from the car before he was pulled out, flew aside, hitting the pavement. Jamal fell, hitting his head on the sidewalk. The thud of his body hitting the ground echoed in the hearts of those watching. The crowd gasped. A whisper of horror ran among the people. Someone shouted out, "You have no right to do this." The woman with the phone was now filming everything with trembling hands, not taking the camera away from Jamal's motionless body. Thomas walked toward the boy as if he didn't notice the horror around him. His face remained cold, like a man who didn't care. He bent to grab Jamal by the collar and lift him up. "Did you think you could get away?" he said as if addressing the crowd, not the teenager. "That's the way to deal with people like you." Jamal struggled to breathe, but his chest wouldn't listen. His eyes filled with tears, not from pain, but from sheer humiliation. In that moment, he realized Thomas didn't care that he was innocent. Thomas didn't care that his actions were illegal. To him, Jamal was just another victim of his hatred. "This is too much. Somebody call the police," a woman shouted from the crowd, but no one moved. Fear of power, of repression, stopped people. "I am the police," Thomas snapped, looking over his shoulder. His voice was full of mockery and anger. At that moment, Jamal lost consciousness. His head fell helplessly to the sidewalk. The crowd froze. Some had already started to move away, unable to watch it any longer. Some still called the emergency services, hoping that someone else could stop this nightmare. But Thomas knew that nothing would happen to him. He was sure the system had his back. He didn't suspect that the boy who now lay at his feet wasn't just another victim. This incident would be the beginning of a chain of events that would change his life forever. The police car pulled up to the station, and Thomas yanked the door open, pulling a collapsed Jamal outside. The teenager was barely on his feet after the stun gun. His hands were still handcuffed and his forehead was bleeding from the impact with the pavement. Thomas paid no attention to the boy's condition, as if he were not a human being but a bag of problems. "Come on, move," he threw roughly, pushing Jamal forward. The boy stepped inside the building, and the noise of the station, the ringing of phones, muffled voices, and the clatter of keys increased his fear instantly. In the detention room, Thomas placed Jamal in a hard metal chair and leaned over him, looking directly into his eyes. His face was a mixture of contempt and sadistic pleasure. "All right, kid, spill it. Who the hell are you? What the hell are you doing out on the streets at night?" Thomas spat the words out, not expecting an answer. He savored his moment of power. Jamal, despite the pain and humiliation, gathered all his strength. His voice was weak but determined. My mom's a prosecutor. She's not going to let this go." Thomas froze for a second, then burst into loud laughter. His husky voice echoed through the room. "Your mom's a prosecutor?" he repeated, looking at Jamal as if he'd just told a ridiculous joke. "That's what you all say. Every other detainee here has moms, dads, or uncles who are lawyers, prosecutors, and judges, and they'll all figure it out. You ain't got nothing new, kid." "It's true," Jamal insisted, though his voice was getting weaker. "Her name is Monica Harris. She's the district attorney for the county. You'll be sorry." The name hurt Thomas. Doubt flashed in his eyes for a moment, but he quickly dismissed it. He couldn't believe that a black woman and the mother of someone like Jamal could hold such a high office. "Harris, you say? Well, okay, let's see what kind of prosecutor you have." Thomas grinned, picking up the phone and dialing the number Jamal had struggled to dictate. He hadn't expected anything special. For Thomas, it was just another bluff, an attempt to get away with it. He had already thought of ways to humiliate the boy even more when his lie was exposed. But a phone call changed everything. At the other end of the wire, a woman's voice answered, cold and clear, as if sharpened by years of litigation. "Monica Harris speaking. Who is this?" The voice sounded calm, but there was a sharp alertness in it. "This is Officer Thomas Grace from the 12th Precinct. We've taken your son into custody for suspicious behavior. I've been informed that you're the prosecutor." Thomas tried to make his voice condescending with a touch of sarcasm. There was silence for a second. Then the voice became icy. "Where's my son? What have you done with him?" Monica spoke softly, but her words cut like a knife. "Your son was disturbing the order," Thomas began, but was interrupted. "My son is a 14-year-old on crutches," Monica said with murderous clarity. "Did you detain him for coming home suspiciously? Do you realize who you're talking to, officer?" Thomas felt a cold sweat roll down his back. This wasn't just another call. It was the voice of authority, the voice of a man who could really strike a blow to his career. "We have grounds for detention." Thomas tried to regain his confidence, but even his voice trembled. "Grounds?" Monica literally exhaled the word. "What grounds? The color of his skin? His age? Or his disability? Do you even realize what you've done? My son was beaten, humiliated, and now he's in your precinct. I'll be there in 10 minutes, and if one hair falls from his head before I get there, it's the end of you." The connection went dead. Thomas put the phone back on base, feeling the tension building. The crowd at the station was beginning to notice his unease. He turned to Jamal, who was silent, but there was a faint spark of hope in his eyes. "Well, we'll see who she is," Thomas muttered, trying to hide his anxiety. But in the back of his mind, he already knew this case wasn't going to turn out the way he'd hoped. Anxiety began to build until the station door swung open. Monica Harris walked in. Her gaze was heavy, her walk confident. And Thomas knew. This wasn't just a challenge, it was the beginning of his end. The door of the police station rattled open. Monica Harris stepped inside, and her presence changed the atmosphere at once. People at their desks looked up. Conversations died down, and tension hung in the air. Her stern suit emphasized authority, but there was something more in her eyes, a mixture of anger, pain, and determination. She hadn't just come here for her son. She had come for justice. Her heels sounded like gunshots as she moved confidently toward the counter behind which the duty officer stood. "Where is my son?" she asked. Her voice was low, but there was steel in it. The officer hesitated, his face pale. He glanced at Thomas, who was standing at the far table, pretending to do paperwork. There was a sense in the air that a storm was approaching. "Officer Grace," Monica said loudly, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "Come over here." Now Thomas, who until that moment had tried to ignore what was happening, reluctantly put down his pen and walked over. There was a sneer on his face, but uncertainty in his eyes. "Minus Miss Harris," he said, trying to sound confident. "Your son is in custody for suspicious behavior. We were obliged to act within the law." Monica took a step closer, her eyes burning. "Detained?" Her voice was quiet but menacing. "Suspicious behavior. My 14-year-old son on crutches? You call that grounds for use of force?" The crowd of employees froze, listening to the conversation. Thomas tried to remain calm. "We had our reasons," he said, but his voice trembled. "Reasons?" Monica repeated, her anger rising. "You threw him to the ground, tasered him when he didn't even resist. Did you see his condition? Or is your racism so blinding that you can't tell the difference between a child and a criminal?" "Ma'am, let's not be insulting," Thomas began, but Monica interrupted him. "Insult?" Her voice rose. "You are the one insulting the very concept of justice. You humiliated my son, abused him, all because you thought a black teenager was suspicious." She took a deep breath, trying to deal with her emotions. She knew that to let herself get off balance was to give Thomas the advantage. "I demand to see my son, immediately," she said coldly. Thomas looked at the officer on duty and nodded. A few minutes later, the door opened and 2 officers brought Jamal in. He was weak, his face pale and his gaze wan. When Monica saw him, her heart clenched. She walked over to her son, gingerly touched his face, examined his wrists, reddened from the handcuffs and the bruise on his forehead. Her hands were trembling. "Mom," Jamal whispered, looking at her with desperation. "It's okay, baby. I'm here," she replied, holding back tears. She rose and turned to Thomas again. Now her voice was even more cold and honed. "You have exceeded your authority. It's not just a violation, it's a crime. I will hold you accountable for your actions." Thomas tried to object. "Ma'am, we were just doing our job," but she didn't let him finish. "That's not a job. It's an abuse of power. It's racism at its worst, and I will not let it go unpunished." She turned to the officer on duty. "I want copies of all reports, security footage of my son's arrest, immediately." The officer nodded awkwardly and hurriedly complied with her demands. Monica realized that this case went beyond her personal pain. It was an example of how the system breaks those it is supposed to protect. And she vowed that this case would be the beginning of the end for people like Thomas. She led Jamal toward the exit, hugging him tightly around the shoulders. But before she left, she cast one last glance at Thomas. "You made the biggest mistake of your life." Thomas stood motionless, his face grim, while Monica's words echoed in his head. He realized that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Let's pause for one more brief moment. Write in the comments where you're hearing our stories from, and whether something similar has happened in your life. It's important for us to know your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new stories. And now, we continue. The morning after Jamal's arrest, the Borough Police Chief's office received a formal request from the prosecutor's office. Monica Harris used all her legal experience to demand an immediate internal investigation into the actions of Officer Thomas Grace. Her name on the document instantly attracted attention, for she was known in the county as an uncompromising prosecutor who would not back down in the face of adversity. But there was a whole system lined up against her to protect her own. An internal investigation committee was meeting at the police headquarters. Thomas sat in the conference room, surrounded by his colleagues. His face expressed calmness, but inside, anxiety was eating away at him. He knew that his actions could have consequences, but he also knew that the system was on his side. "Gentlemen," one of the commissioners, the head of internal affairs, began, looking glumly at the papers. "Prosecutor Harris has filed a complaint against Officer Grace. The gist of the complaint: abuse of authority, unlawful detention, and use of force against a teenager. We're obligated to look into it." "It's just another attempt to make us look bad," one of the officers in the audience said sharply. "They do it all the time. Prosecutors, politicians, anyone, just to hit us." "I was acting within the law," Thomas said firmly, though there was a note of irritation in his voice. "Suspicious behavior, refusal to obey. Yes, I used force, but only because it was necessary. He could have been dangerous." "Dangerous?" Another member of the panel stepped in. "We're talking about a teenager on crutches, Grace. Even that doesn't look convincing." The commission was divided. Some felt that Thomas was simply doing his job. Others, perhaps for the first time, felt that such cases were becoming too frequent. But the system did not like to admit its mistakes. Meanwhile, back at the DA's office, Monica was working on gathering evidence. She had already reviewed Jamal's medical reports: cuts on his wrists from handcuffs, bruises from the fall, electrical shock marks. But it wasn't enough. She requested surveillance footage, detention reports, and encountered unexpected obstacles. Her requests were either ignored or denied with the phrase, "due to the protection of confidentiality." It was a game of attrition. "They're trying to stall," she told her assistant, keeping her eyes on the monitor. "They think I'll give up, but I'm not." The patrol car cameras were not working either, the deputy added dryly, handing her another rejection. At least, that's what their response said. Monica gritted her teeth. It was a typical tactic: destroy the evidence, hide the truth behind a bureaucratic veil. She knew Thomas was only part of the problem. The problem was deeper, in the very system that covered up its own. Meanwhile, Thomas felt the support of his colleagues. In the corridors of the police department, he was met with approving glances and pats on the shoulder. "Don't worry, Tom," said one of the officers. "It's just another circus. We'll make sure it all goes away." But not everyone shared this opinion. There was talk among the junior staff that Thomas had really gone overboard. Some were beginning to realize that this case might go beyond the usual cover-up. "You realize she's not going to stop," one of his colleagues told him. "It's Harris. If she said she would get to the truth, she will." Thomas brushed it off, but unease was growing inside him. On the third day after the incident, Monica received an anonymous call. The man's voice sounded muffled, as if the man feared he might be overheard. "I work for the department," he said. "I have information about your case. The cameras in Thomas's car weren't turned off. They're hiding the footage. Monica squeezed the phone. It was the string that needed to be pulled. "Why do you want to help me?" she asked. "Because what he did was wrong," the voice replied briefly. And it wasn't the first time. Monica realized that she had a long and grueling road ahead of her. Her opponents would use every resource to hide the truth. But she knew this case wasn't just about her son. It was a case about fighting a system that had suppressed and broken people for years. Jamal's words echoed in her head. "They think there's nothing we can do." She swore she would prove otherwise. Monica Harris knew Jamal's case wasn't just a fight for justice for her son. It was a chance to shed light on the dark secrets of a police department that had been harboring officers for years. As she began to dig deeper, she encountered reluctance and resistance at every turn. But every refusal, every barrier only strengthened her resolve. The first lid came a week after the investigation began. An anonymous source who had called her earlier had given her a file of complaints against Officer Thomas Grace. What she saw shocked even her, a person accustomed to the system's dirty games. The document included more than a dozen complaints over the past 5 years: unlawful detention, abuse of power, racist remarks, and even violence. However, each complaint was rejected or lost at the review stage. Monica immediately realized that Thomas was not just an individual villain. His actions were covered up from above. She called a press conference to announce it publicly. Standing in front of dozens of cameras, she was unwavering. "In the course of investigating my son's case," she began, her voice sounding confident but painful, "I have discovered disturbing facts. Officer Thomas Grace, the officer who abused my son, has a long list of complaints that have been ignored or covered up. This is not an isolated incident. This is a systemic problem." She paused, giving reporters time to absorb her words. "This investigation is not just about my son. This case concerns all those who have suffered abuses of power. We demand full transparency and justice. This is not just my fight. It is a fight for everyone who has been betrayed by the system." After speaking at the press conference, excitement around the case began to grow. Journalists began their own investigations, finding victims of other cases of Thomas's abuse. Stories of people who claimed to have been treated unfairly also appeared on social networks. "Thomas stopped me at night and threatened to put me in jail if I didn't confess to a crime I didn't commit," one user wrote. "He beat me and then claimed that I resisted. My complaint disappeared," shared a woman whose case happened 3 years ago. These stories fueled public opinion. The police department was under tremendous pressure, but instead of recognizing the problems, they went on the offensive. The county's police chief, James Randall, issued a statement. "We categorically reject allegations of systematic abuse. Officer Thomas Grace performed his duties under difficult circumstances. Any allegations against him must be properly investigated." But Monica didn't let that tactic distract her. She gained access to surveillance video footage from the street where Jamal was detained, and the footage was a bombshell. The video clearly showed Thomas first chasing Jamal for no reason and then using force when the boy couldn't resist. This footage became a key argument. When Monica released them to the media, the police department found itself in an even more difficult position. Thomas Grace, feeling the ground slipping away from under his feet, tried to defend himself. His lawyer made an official statement. "Officer Grace acted within the bounds of the law and his position. We are confident that the court will uphold his actions." But that argument failed to quell public anger. Dozens of protesters marched to the police department building. People demanded not only Thomas's dismissal, but also a complete overhaul of the system. Meanwhile, Monica continued to gather evidence. She found Thomas's connections to high-ranking figures in the department who covered up his actions. One of them, a captain, had personally canceled complaints against Grace on the grounds of insufficient evidence. "They are not protecting the law, but themselves," she said in an interview, "and we will stop it." 3 weeks after the investigation began, a formal charge against Thomas Grace was filed in municipal court. Monica insisted that an independent prosecutor review the case to eliminate any attempt to pressure the court. Thomas was suspended, but his support in the department remained strong. "We have to protect our own," said one officer at the department meeting. "If we turn Grays in, it opens the door to charges against all of us." But not everyone was in agreement. Young officers began to say that it was time to change the system. They began to leak information to journalists, providing data on other similar cases. Monica knew the fight wasn't over. She knew Thomas was just the tip of the iceberg, but her work was paying off. Public opinion began to change. People began to ask questions not only about Thomas, but about the entire system that allowed people like him to thrive. She was sitting in her office, looking at pictures of Jamal when the phone rang. "Mine is Ms. Harris," said the voice on the other end. "Thank you for doing this. We support you." She hung up the phone and smiled. It wasn't the end, but it was the beginning of a change she intended to see through. The trial of Officer Thomas Grace began in a crowded courtroom. The atmosphere was intense. Journalists filled every corner. Protesters stood outside the courthouse with placards, and inside there was a heavy silence, broken only by the whispers of reporters and the sound of doors opening. Monica Harris entered the hall, accompanied by a team of lawyers. She looked impeccable, but behind her calmness was a determination that could not be shaken even by the threats of the system. On the other side of the room sat Thomas Grace, his face tense. His lawyer, a well-known defender of police officers, had strategized to justify Grace's actions through the prism of his difficult job and need to maintain order. The judge announced the beginning of the trial. The prosecutor assigned to the case spoke first. He described the events of that night, how Thomas had stopped Jamal without justification, how he had used a stun gun on an unarmed teenager on crutches, how the department had tried to cover up the records and complaints. "This case is not just about abuse of power," the prosecutor said, looking the jury straight in the eye. "This is a case about how a system that is supposed to protect citizens becomes an instrument of oppression. We will show that Thomas Grace's actions were not a mistake, but a conscious decision backed by the tacit approval of his colleagues." When the turn came to the defense, Thomas's attorney tried to turn the situation around. "My client is a police officer with many years of experience. Every day he faces dangers that ordinary citizens don't even realize. His actions that night were motivated solely by a concern for public safety." He added that Jamal's detention was justified by his suspicious behavior and tried to portray the boy as aggressive. "We contend that Officer Grace acted within the law and did everything he could to minimize the threat." Monica clenched her fists as she listened to her son being made out to be the guilty party and Thomas the victim of circumstance. The key moment was the presentation of video footage. The prosecutor included footage from a surveillance camera showing Thomas chasing Jamal, stopping the boy for no apparent reason and using force when the teenager failed to quickly comply with his commands. There was silence in the room. The video footage spoke for itself. Jamal's face flashed on the screen. Frightened, exhausted. Everyone who watched the video could feel the injustice. "It's a child," the prosecutor said, stopping the video. "He was not a threat. He didn't commit a crime. His only fault was that he got in the way of a man who was used to using his power to suppress." When it was Monica's turn to testify, the hall froze. She stepped up to the podium, her gaze firm. "I'm not just Jamal's mother," she began. "I'm a prosecutor, and I've seen a lot of injustice in my career. But what happened to my son is beyond human comprehension. This is not just a case of abuse of power. This is systemic racism that has been eroding our society for years." She spoke of Jamal's torture, of the pain he felt, of the fear he now feels every time he sees a police car. Her voice shook when she mentioned how her son had asked her why his skin color made him the enemy. "I'm not just demanding justice for my son. I demand justice for every child who has been hurt by the likes of Thomas Grace." The defense tried to object, accusing Monica of using her status to pressure the court. They argued that she was motivated by emotion, not facts. But each time Thomas's lawyer made another attack, the prosecutor presented more evidence. On the third day of the hearing, documents about past complaints against Thomas were presented. The jury saw that he had repeatedly overstepped his authority, but had gone unpunished each time. That was the turning point. Thomas himself also took the stand. His lawyer had carefully prepared his speech. He talked about the difficulties of his job, about the need to act quickly and decisively. He tried to convince the jury that he had no malicious intent, but on cross-examination, the prosecutor put him in a corner. "Do you believe the teenager on crutches was a threat?" he asked. "It could have been a cover-up," Thomas replied, clearly losing confidence. "A cover? For what? For the textbooks and notebooks you threw on the ground? Or for his crutches? You claim your fear was justified, but isn't it your duty to act with caution and respect for people?" Thomas fell silent. His silence spoke louder than words. As the case came to a close, the prosecutor made his final speech. "We've seen the evidence. We have heard the testimony. This case is not an exception, but a symptom of a broader problem. But today, we have an opportunity to show that no one, not even those in uniform, is above the law." The jury retired to deliberate, and the room froze in anticipation. Monica sat next to Jamal, holding his hand. She knew this was more than her son's case. This was a fight for justice for everyone the system had failed. When the jury returned, the foreman announced the verdict. "We find Thomas Grace guilty of abuse of authority and use of unreasonable violence." The hall erupted in applause and shouts of joy. Monica pulled Jamal close to her, tears streaming down her face. It was a victory, but she knew there was more work to be done to change the system itself. The jury's verdict was a powerful blow to a system that for years had seemed indestructible. Thomas Grace was found guilty, and he would have to answer for his actions. But this was more than just punishing one man. It was a signal that impunity was no longer the norm. A few days after the trial, Jamal, still recovering from his injuries, made his first public appearance with his mother. They gave an interview in which they not only talked about their suffering, but also called for change. "It's not just about us," Monica said, holding her son's hand. "It's about everyone who has faced injustice. This case is not the end of the story, but the beginning." Her words went viral on the news and social media. People were inspired by their courage and determination. Protests against police violence erupted across the country, demanding reform of the system. Thomas Grace found himself isolated. His colleagues who had previously supported him began to distance themselves, realizing that their own careers might be at risk. But the hardest part was ahead. His prison sentence was not only a punishment, but also a chance for him to realize how his actions had destroyed lives. His lawyer tried to file an appeal, but the court refused to consider it, arguing that there was strong evidence of his guilt. Meanwhile, changes have begun to take place in the police department. County Police Chief James Randall resigned after revelations surfaced that he covered up complaints against Thomas and other officers. He was replaced by a man who has publicly stated a willingness to implement transparent procedures. "We can no longer turn a blind eye to problems," the new police chief said at a press conference. "If we want to regain the public's trust, we need to start with ourselves." But change has been slow. For many in the department, the Thomas case was a reminder that the system can protect only up to a point. Some continued to resist reform, seeing it as a threat to their power. Jamal, despite winning in court, faced his own hardships. His injuries healed, but the mental scars remained. He became withdrawn, afraid to go out alone, and flinched at the sight of police uniforms. His mother found him a psychologist to help him cope with his anxiety. "You're strong, Jamal," Monica told him. "What you've been through shouldn't define your life. You won, and your story will change the world." Jamal gradually began to return to a normal life. He began to spend more time with friends, returned to his studies, and even began to take an interest in law, inspired by his mother's example. But was it enough to change the world? That's a question many people have asked themselves. Yes, Jamal's case attracted attention. Yes, it inspired thousands of people to fight for justice. But a deeply entrenched system continued to resist. It was a few months after the trial when Monica received an unexpected phone call. It was one of the police officers who had previously worked with Thomas. "Minus Ms. Harris," he began. "I wanted to say, thank you. You did what we didn't have the courage to do. Thomas isn't the only one. There are many. But after what you've done, I believe we can make a difference." Monica smiled. It was a small sign that change was possible. Jamal's case became a symbol. It was discussed in schools, universities, workplaces. It made people think about the importance of not being indifferent to injustice. But most importantly, it inspired a generation of young people who wanted to see a fairer world. A year after the trial, Monica and Jamal stood on stage at a conference on law enforcement reform. Jamal, nervous, took the microphone and looked out into the audience. "I don't want anyone else to go through what I went through," he said, his voice shaky but firm. "It shouldn't depend on the color of your skin or what you look like. We all deserve to be heard and protected. I believe we can change that." Applause filled the hall. Monica looked at her son, and her eyes filled with pride. This journey had been long and painful, but it had proved that even the darkest night could end with a dawn. While the world didn't change instantly, Jamal and Monica's story was a lesson for everyone. A lesson that justice is possible if you fight for it. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you experienced racism in your life? Your opinions and stories are very important to us. We sincerely appreciate each of you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and put a like if this story touched you. We wish you a good and peaceful day.